The United States Navy today is the most powerful maritime force on Earth. But given that China is currently in the midst of building an enlarged Navy, one that is apparently intended to challenge the United States for supremacy, does that pose a threat to America and its allies? It is perhaps the foremost question on the minds of naval strategists today. China's historical contributions to civilization easily stand up to those of Europe and the West. Mechanical clocks, gunpowder, the compass, all these were invented and developed in China. Chinese printers were using movable type 400 years before Gutenberg, and they printed on paper, another Chinese invention. And yet, for 1,000 years and more, Westerners conceived of China mainly as an abstraction, almost a mythological conception, rather than as a nation state. They knew there was great wealth in China in the form of silks, spices, art, and other things, and China's large population constituted a potentially vast market for European goods. So beginning in the 17th century and reaching a peak in the 19th century, Europeans set up shop all over eastern China and especially along the coast. These European outposts were called treaty ports, and they were, in all but name, virtual colonies of European nations. In addition, Europeans often caricatured the Chinese themselves as comical figures, greedy and untrustworthy people in pigtails, whose alien culture could safely be disregarded, if not openly mocked. Unsurprisingly, such treatment bred resentment. The United States did not participate in the contest for trading outposts. There was no American treaty port. Instead, in 1900, the American Secretary of State John Hay came up with a policy he called the open door. Its central tenet was that China's ports should not belong to one or another European power. Rather, they should be open to all, including, of course, the United States. Almost as an afterthought, Hay's open-door announcement called for Chinese territorial and administrative integrity, though few took that part very seriously. In response to these Western encroachments on its territory, a large number of Chinese joined a movement known rather colorfully as the Righteous and Harmonious Fists, but which Westerners referred to as the Boxers. Their goal was pretty direct. It was to get the foreigners out of China, and they prevailed on the Dowager Empress to order all foreigners to leave. When the Europeans ignored that order, the Boxers took matters into their own hands. In 1901, they began a rampage targeting what they called the foreign devils, including missionaries and diplomats. In response, Westerners took refuge in a walled section of Peking, now Beijing, known as the Foreign Quarter. The Boxers besieged them there, and eventually they were joined by the regular Chinese army. The Western refugees held out for 55 days, defended by 450 soldiers, including 48 U.S. Marines and 5 sailors from the cruiser USS Newark. Ultimately, an international army of more than 18,000 British, French, German, Italian, Russian, and Japanese, plus 500 U.S. Marines and 2,000 U.S. Army soldiers, fought its way to Peking from the coast. The Dowager Empress fled the city and went into exile. China's inability to defend itself contributed to the collapse of the imperial regime. There were a few efforts to establish a republic, but they all failed, and the country virtually broke apart. Political authority fell into the hands of competing bands of warlords, and Western nations continued to exercise all but sovereign control over great chunks of the China coast. The U.S. Navy even conducted warship patrols on China's inland rivers. Imagine if the Chinese Navy today conducted armed patrols on the Mississippi. There is, by the way, a wonderful novel by Richard McKenna about American gunboats in China called The Sand Pebbles, and a very good film based on it. Both offer useful insight into this curious dynamic. A major turning point came in 1937 when an incident near a stone bridge, the Marco Polo Bridge, 10 miles southwest of Peking, led to a full-scale war between China and Japan. It was the event that marked the beginning of the Second World War. Japan's army won most of the battles and conquered great swaths of Chinese territory, but China is a big country, and in time, Japan found itself bogged down. Frustrated by their inability to bring the war to a conclusion, the Japanese employed modern warfare tactics, including the aerial bombardment of cities, and rather notoriously what has come to be known as the Rape of Nanking, in which the Japanese killed an estimated 250,000 Chinese. Frustrated by their inability to bring the war to an end and desperate for more resources to continue it, Japan cast covetous eyes on the resource-rich colonies of British Malaya and the Dutch East Indies. Those colonies seemed ripe for the plucking, since by then both Britain and Holland had their hands full fighting Nazi Germany. One concern, though, was that the Americans in the Philippine Islands could interfere with shipments of goods from the Dutch East Indies to Japan. So the Japanese warlords decided they had to attack the United States too. After the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, China and the United States became de facto allies. Over the next 4 years, as American soldiers and Marines fought their way across the Pacific from Guadalcanal to Okinawa, the Chinese continued their own war against Japan. The United States lost 100,000 men killed in the Pacific War. The Chinese lost 4 million soldiers, plus another 18 million civilians, roughly 200 times American losses. After the war, U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt was eager to sustain the nationalist Chinese government, which he hoped would fill the power vacuum left by the defeat of Japan. That is why China got a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council in 1945. But there is another chapter to this complicated story. Almost the moment World War II ended, a civil war emerged between Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government and Mao Zedong's communists. In 1949, Mao's forces drove Chiang's nationalists off the mainland and onto the offshore island of Formosa, now called Taiwan. For 2 decades after that, the United States insisted that Chiang's nationalist government on Taiwan, and not the communist government on the mainland, was the rightful holder of the permanent Security Council seat at the United Nations. Then in 1972, President Richard Nixon went to China as part of his plan to extricate the United States from Vietnam. And while there, he agreed to recognize Mao's government in Beijing as the real and only China. From then until now, the United States has officially held to what is called the One China policy, that the Beijing government is the rightful ruler of all China, including Taiwan. Yet at the same time, the United States did not abandon its support of Taiwan and repeatedly promised to defend it against an invasion from the mainland. It was, and it remains, an utterly contradictory and unsustainable policy, though it has lasted for decades. Sustaining it, however, will require some deft maneuvering because China has declared that it will take Taiwan by force if necessary no later than 2049, which is the 100th anniversary of the Communist Revolution. That is the context for the current rivalry at sea between the Chinese Navy and the U.S. Navy. What role, if any, should the U.S. Navy play in the defense of Taiwan? China is essentially a continental power. Of course, so is the United States, which proves that being a continental power does not foreclose also being a naval power. As early as 1975, Chairman Mao himself argued that China was destined to become a great naval power. And in the last few decades, China has made significant progress toward that objective. China's Navy has an awkward name because the communist victory in the Civil War was won by the People's Liberation Army, the PLA. The new government conceived of a naval force as an adjunct to the Army and named it the People's Liberation Army Navy, or PLAN. My guess is you would not get very far today by suggesting that the U.S. Navy should be called the U.S. Army Navy. I guess that would make the Army-Navy game the Army-Navy game. Initially, the Chinese structured their Navy as a coastal defense force, consisting mostly of small patrol boats. Such vessels still make up the bulk of China's Navy. Their purpose is to defend the waters inside what the Chinese call the First Island Chain. This is an imaginary line that runs southward from Japan to the Philippines and encompasses both the East China Sea and, significantly, the South China Sea. It includes the island of Taiwan and all of the South China Sea. Many of the islands there are so small they barely break the surface of the sea, though that has not kept them from provoking fierce arguments and even active confrontations with Japan and others about just who has a right to them. The Chinese claim to all this sea space derives from a map published by a Chinese cartographer in the 1940s. The map includes what is called the 9-dash line, which the Chinese assert establishes Chinese sovereignty over the entire area inside that line, including the Paracel and the Spratly Islands. In the last few decades, China has established extensive military bases on several of the islands there, even building up artificial islands on shoals using landfill to construct naval bases and airfields. China's claim to the islands and to the South China Sea generally is disputed by most other countries, including the Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, as well as the United States, which insists that the South China Sea is international waters. To validate that, the U.S. Navy periodically conducts what are called freedom of navigation exercises through the area. Typically, when a U.S. Navy ship or aircraft comes near one of the Chinese-occupied islands, the island's commander will send out a radio warning. "This is sovereign Chinese territory, stay away." The American ship or plane usually responds with something like, "I am a sovereign U.S. Navy ship conducting lawful activities in international waters. Do not interfere." Sometimes that's all there is to it. But it has occasionally led to dangerous games of chicken. The Chinese might send out a military jet to shadow the American ship or plane, and they will fly close, often perilously close, to what they perceive as an interloper. On such occasions, the Americans will radio the Chinese to stay clear, that they are violating both international law and understood safety protocols. The Chinese goal in all this is to get the American ship or plane to change course, or indeed to react at all, in effect to blink. If they succeed, it becomes a kind of de facto acknowledgement by the United States that the area is indeed Chinese territory, something the United States is unwilling to concede. Because the Chinese bases in the Spratly Islands are armed with anti-ship and anti-air missiles, conducting these freedom of navigation exercises can be dangerous. So far, the games of chicken have not resulted in either a collision or in shots being fired. But if it did come to shots being fired, how would the U.S. Navy fare in a contest with the PLAN in the South China Sea? Let's start by taking a look at the two navies. A recent U.S. government white paper acknowledges that the Chinese Navy is actually larger than the U.S. Navy, at least larger by counting the number of combat warships in commission. The Chinese have about 350 compared to America's 293. On the other hand, simply counting the number of gray hulls is an imperfect index of actual naval power. Today's U.S. Navy warship roster includes 115 major surface combatants, cruisers, frigates, and destroyers, plus 68 submarines and 31 amphibious ships, and, here is the big difference, 11 large-deck nuclear-powered aircraft carriers, the newest of which is the USS Gerald R. Ford, which is not only the largest Navy carrier, it is the largest warship ever built, displacing more than 100,000 tons even without its air wing. By comparison, much of the Chinese Navy is made up of Type 22 Hubei missile patrol boats, which displaces only 220 tons. So if instead of the number of ships, we count the total displacement of the warships on each side, the U.S. Navy is more than twice as large, 4.6 million tons to just under 2 million tons. So if it is not technically the largest Navy on Earth, the U.S. Navy is, and by a significant margin, the most powerful. Still, even that may not be the best way to compare the two navies, because the key question in assessing any naval force is this: can it do what it was designed to do? The structure of the modern U.S. Navy, with its emphasis on large deck aircraft carriers, makes it what is called a projection force. That is, a force capable of going almost anywhere on Earth to represent the interests of the United States. It might be to signal American concern during a crisis, to enforce the peace in a volatile area, or, if necessary, to exercise military control over an area or a situation. On occasion, it is also called upon to perform humanitarian missions. A U.S. Navy carrier battle group consists of one nuclear-powered carrier and its embarked air group, usually between 64 and 85 aircraft of various capabilities and functions, accompanied by one or two missile-firing cruisers, 2 or 3 destroyers, 1 or more auxiliary, and perhaps a nuclear-powered submarine. Assuming that its air group carries nuclear weapons, such a battle group would have as much combat firepower as the entire Navy of most other countries on Earth. And remember, the United States has 11 of them. though it is unlikely that it would ever deploy all 11 at the same time. The PLAN is not a projection navy, it is a sea denial navy. That is, it exists primarily to defend the areas of the Western Pacific that China considers part of its national territory, including the South China Sea. So while the U.S. Navy seeks to project its power into China's sphere of influence, the Chinese cannot really project their naval power into America's spheres of influence. Given growing international anxiety about China's intentions in the South China Sea and the security of Taiwan, however, the real question is, could the U.S. Navy project itself into the South China Sea or the Strait of Taiwan to defeat China's sea denial navy? Herein lies another interesting comparison, one involving the newest generation of naval ordnance. America's commitment to the aircraft carrier stems in part from the final years of the Second World War, when U.S. carrier task forces dominated the Pacific. Since then, the carriers have gotten much bigger, and the planes they carried far more sophisticated and expensive. The modern aircraft carrier might or might not be the most efficient platform for projecting power, but there is no doubting its political impact. Other nations recognize that. And it may be as much to assert great power status as to command the sea that both India and China launched new aircraft carriers in 2022. On the other hand, the emergence of ship-killing missiles, such as the US-made Harpoon, the Chinese-made Silkworm, and for that matter, the Ukrainian-made Neptune, which sank the Russian flagship Moskva in the Black Sea after Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, have demonstrated that relatively inexpensive missiles can pose a significant threat to the largest of warships. I referred earlier to the Type 22 Hubei Chinese patrol boat. Each of these small vessels carries 8 anti-ship missiles. In a scenario where 20 or 30 of them conduct a swarm attack against an American carrier battle group, it is not inconceivable that some of those missiles might find its target. Chinese Admiral Liu Huaqing was the senior officer in the PLAN during the 1980s and 90s. He was the last uniformed officer to serve on China's Politburo Standing Committee. In all his various roles, Liu argued that China should have greater maritime aspirations. He accepted that until 2010, China would have to focus on the area inside the first island chain. But after that, he insisted, China should become a regional force, capable of projecting its influence out to what China calls the second island chain. This is a much larger area, encompassing the Philippines and the Philippine Sea, out to Guam and the Marianas Island chain. More to the point, Liu forecast a third phase after 2020, in which China's Navy would abandon its sea denial strategy and become a projection Navy with aircraft carriers that could operate anywhere in the Pacific or beyond. Liu died in 2011, and it's not certain that his vision still informs Chinese planning or that, given China's many other problems and priorities, it can muster either the political will or the financial wherewithal to achieve his vision. Yet there are a number of voices in the U.S. Navy today that argue it is at least possible that China will follow this blueprint and that the U.S. Navy should treat such aspirations seriously. U.S. plans call for an increase in the size of its own Navy from 293 warships to 330 by the year 2049, which, not coincidentally, is China's self-imposed deadline for its projected conquest and occupation of Taiwan. Meanwhile, China will likely continue to assert a right to all the seas and islands inside the 9-dash line. They also seem determined to invest more money and effort to the construction of a true blue water fleet that contains at least a few large-deck aircraft carriers. The story of China's acquisition of its first aircraft carrier is a tale in itself. When the Soviet Empire broke apart in 1991, its naval assets were divided among the 15 nations that formerly comprised the USSR. Russia got most of them, but Ukraine got what was at the time an unfinished Kuznetsov-class carrier called the Varyag, which was under construction at a Crimean shipyard. The Ukrainian government, however, did not want to spend the money needed to finish the project and saw no need for an aircraft carrier, so they put it up for sale. Initially, there were no buyers, and the Varyag sat untended for several years while it slowly deteriorated. Then in 1998, the Hulk, for by then it wasn't much more than that, was bought by a shell company in Macau that purportedly planned to turn it into a floating casino. Even then, some suspected that the Chinese planned all along to finish it and turn it into a warship. The Varyag's trip from the Crimea to China was harrowing. With its engines shut down, it had to proceed under tow. And Turkish authorities wouldn't allow it to enter the Bosphorus for fear that it would become stuck there and block traffic. For almost 2 years, it was towed in circles around the Black Sea until the Turks relented and allowed it to pass into the Mediterranean. Unpowered ships are not allowed to use the Suez Canal either. So the Varyag then had to be towed the length of the Mediterranean, out through the Strait of Gibraltar, and then south all the way around Africa and into the Indian Ocean. It finally arrived in Chinese waters after a 4-year odyssey in February of 2002. Then from 2005 to 2011, it underwent significant refit, supposedly to become a scientific research ship. Instead, in 2012, it was handed over to the Chinese Navy as a fully operational aircraft carrier named the Liaoning, which is the name of the Chinese province where it was refitted. The Chinese are famously expert at reverse engineering. That is, studying a prototype and then replicating its characteristics in a similar, if not quite identical, new version. Even before the Liaoning was commissioned in 2018, the Chinese began building her sister ship, the Shandong, in the same shipyard, and she was commissioned in 2019. Both ships have a ski jump flight deck designed to give a boost to launching airplanes. Other navies employ this system as well, including the Queen Elizabeth-class carriers of the Royal Navy. Each of the Chinese carriers displaces about 60,000 tons. That is just over half of the Gerald R. Ford, but still substantial by any standard. Early flight operations on the Chinese carriers were marred by accidents, but ultimately both ships were able to launch and recover airplanes at a professional level. And in 2022, the Chinese unveiled the hull of a third carrier, an 80,000-ton behemoth to be named the Fujian. This newest Chinese carrier does not have a ski jump design and instead employs a sophisticated electromagnetic catapult like those on the newest U.S. carriers. Thus, the Chinese Navy, which had no carriers at all as recently as 2015, will have 3 of them by 2025. Instead of a sea denial Navy based on missile-firing surface ships, China seems determined to develop a projection Navy centered around large aircraft carriers. How much of a concern is that? It's not likely that the Chinese anticipate using the Fujian or any of their carriers to engage in a slugfest with the U.S. Navy, a confrontation in which they would be clearly overmatched. It is more likely they see these carriers as symbols of China's aspirations, essentially naval ornaments that signal to the world that China is a great power of the first rank. In other words, the Fujian might be intended less for war with the United States than to show the flag, the red flag of Communist China. All that sounds pretty ominous, and American naval leaders are right to be paying attention. But here's an important thing to remember. In history, including naval history, the only sure thing is change. As we have seen in this lecture series, the United States, and in particular the United States Navy, has confronted a wide variety of challenges, from the British, the French, the Spanish, the Germans, the Japanese, the Russians, and now the Chinese. The threats were all different, as was the technology. But in all these cases, America and its Navy adjusted, survived, and ultimately triumphed. Whether the current challenge from China is bluff, intimidation, and bluster, or portends future conflict, here's my advice. If you're a betting person, bet everything you have on the U.S. Navy.